So today we are commemorating African American History Month, and it's my pleasure to have all of you, wherever you are coming from. And I want to start, as we usually start in all our programs, to talk a little bit about SDIG. SDIG is an organization formed on the premise that getting to know people is quite unbelievable joy, and yet we are living in a world where everyone is just going busy and connecting with people is almost becoming impossible. So we bring people from all over the world because we believe that we are shaped by our environments. Therefore, the best way to know people, whether they have good idea or bad idea, is to get to know them. And by getting to know them, we'll be able to decide which one are the good and bad. And sometimes some people develop bad ideas not because they want to, it's because of where they found themselves. How many of us determine where they have to be born, or the kind of parents they want to have, or the kind of community they want to live? If you do, you tell us. For me, even though I know that I was very lucky to have the greatest parents I could ever imagine, I still know that in some cases it's not the case. So for me to know others, I have to get to know their lives. And when I know their lives, then I'll be able to talk about them. So that's why SDIG believes that first and foremost, we have to get to know people, hear their stories, hear where they have been. By so doing, they're gonna get to know us. And when they know us, we begin to enjoy the importance of engaging with people in ways that are meaningful. We learn from them, they learn from us. Ultimately, it elevates all of us a new and higher contour of learning process, which of course continues till we die. So for this occasion, I'm gonna transfer it to my co-moderator, Professor Namita Rajput. And Namita, would you take it from there? And then we're gonna go to questions, and then we're gonna, move. And we're gonna have fewer questions to give our audience the opportunity to ask questions, because they're a very important part of our program. Over to you, Professor.
My greetings to all the esteemed panelists. So we welcome you to this program. And as far as the program is concerned, my first question is for Dr. Angela. Since I can see that you are doing a great job as far as people and culture strategy and conflict mediation is concerned, you are an author, trainer, public speaker. You hold a PhD degree in public administration, specialize in organizational culture, leadership, and conflict resolution, and whatnot. The story is, not short. So I really want you to, give 3 to 7 minutes and explain about your profile and enlighten us in this regard. Over to you, Doctor.
It's really an honor to be here today, and I want to thank Dr. Joseph and the rest of the panelists, and I hope they show up today. I had an opportunity to meet them prior to this great discussion today. But it's important. This is an important conversation about equity and social justice and the continuous work of creating spaces where all of our voices are valued. And I think that's really, really important. And thank you for the introduction. My name is Dr. Angela Cleo Smith. And my journey in this work has been shaped by both personal conviction and professional experience. So whether it's through my work as a housing advocate, my engagement with DEI conversations, or even my commitment to fostering relationships that advance understanding and change. So my background expands to, like you mentioned, Professor, restorative justice practices, conflict mediation, and DEI training and consulting. And right now, during this current climate, I'm a people strategist. And what that means is I focus on creating and implementing strategies that enhance the organizations or people in general, to ensure that every employee, every person, regardless of your background, has the tools, the resources, and support to thrive. And I think that's important in anyone's work, because my work centers on developing talent pipelines, and it shapes inclusive workplace cultures. And then it also fosters equity in every aspect of people management. So in essence, I integrate strategic thinking with human-centered design, if that makes sense. And I create environments where people are not just employees or not just people, but empowered contributors. This includes aligning business goals with DEI efforts, improving retention in workplace, and enhancing leadership diversity, which is very important, and ensure that all employees feel valued and included. So I've spent my career ensuring that diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I always add belonging because it seems to be missing when we say DEI. Belonging is really important as well. They're not just corporate initiatives, but they're real measurable commitments to change. So whether through policy work, education, leadership development, my goal has been to challenge systemic barriers and open pathways for historically marginalized communities. Black and Brown communities continue to face these disparities in wealth, education, and representation. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later today. But equity and social justice are not abstract concepts to me. They are deeply personal. They show up in the communities that I serve, in the challenges that people are facing, and when people seek housing security. Also, these systemic barriers that still exist. And now the language that we're using when we talk about DEI inclusion. So these conversations require more than just good intentions. They demand action. And that's what we'll talk about more today, too. They demand action, accountability, and a willingness to comfort discomfort. So in my work, I'm a licensed realtor. I'm a housing advocate. I see every day how inequities in the access to housing and discriminatory policies that persist despite the progress that we made. So in ways that marginalized communities are often left out of decision making. So housing to me is more than just shelter. It's stability, it's opportunity, and it's dignity. So when we talk about social justice, we must include housing justice as a fundamental pillar. But beyond housing, I want to recognize that equity must be woven into every sector, from education to employment, healthcare, and governance. So it's not just about opening doors. It's about redesigning the structures so that those doors don't need to be forced open. So it's about ensuring that representation is not just symbolic, but it's meaningful. And just to close, I want to say that I am inspired by the resilience of those who fought before us, by the voices that continue to challenge the status quo, and by the collective power, and the collective power that I see even today, we have when we come together with a purpose. So as we engage in today's discussion, my hope is that we not only reflect on the challenges, but also the possibilities on what we can do to move from dialogue to action and from aspiration to impact. Because by the end of the day, equity is not a destination to me. It's a commitment to keep learning, to keep pushing, and to stand up, not just when it's convenient, not just when it's African American Month or Black History Month or it's February, but when it's necessary. So I'm here because that commitment is at the core of who I am and what I do. So thank you for having me today, and I look forward to the conversation.
I really appreciate your words. It was very heartfelt. And to that end, I'm going to go to my friend Greg.
Okay, I'm Greg Biskey. I'm Canadian. Don't hold that against me. I grew up I had a childhood like from a bad novel. My stepfather was a violent alcoholic who hated me. He was a racist. And that one of the reasons he hated me was because first I stopped him from hitting my mother. He taught me how to say, "Don't you hit my mother," when I was 11. And that then taught me how to use fists when I was 12 to stop it. And that, it was all N-word this, slants for Asians. He had a derogatory name for everything. And I used to call him out on it, and that he didn't like that. Okay, so when I was 16, I ran away from home for the last time. I became politicized in 1966, 7, 8. The assassinations and watching America burn. Then it was Chicago Democratic Convention and those riots. And I just went, there has to be a better way. This can't be right. I started protesting the Vietnam War, civil rights. I walked for Greenpeace before they discovered whales. And that, so that I call myself realistic progressive. And so I want all these progressive goals, but that I'm also realistic about how we can get there. And a lot of people tend to be ideological about them. I'm not ideological in any way, or I try not to be. I wanted to go to university. I wrote the scholarship exams at the end of high school. At the end of high school, I was living in friends' houses, in the backs of cars, stealing milk money. It wasn't a good time. But I wrote the exams and got scholarships, but I was broke. I was poor. And so I told them, hey, can you hold these scholarships for a few years? They said no. And I said, well, fine, you keep them. And so I needed a job. I needed a plan. I decided I was going to become an electrician. And in 4 years, I'd be a journeyman. I would be able then to go up north in the summers and make lots of money and come back and pay for school. I was 3 years into the plan. Everything was working. And then in August 1974, I fell at work and broke a vertebrae, and my life irrevocably changed. I have had a couple of spinal fusions. I've had medium to chronic pain in my spine since 1974, every day. No big deal. Pain doesn't kill you. Sometimes it makes you want to be dead, but it certainly doesn't kill you, and I've been able to overcome it. I drove taxi to put myself through university. When finally I was able to walk and do all these good things. I studied political science because I'd always been interested in politics. And I studied China because I thought it would be, in my lifetime, the most important country in the world, or one of, because of the population. People equal power. And so I studied modern Chinese politics, got a master's degree at UBC, and was accepted with a full meal deal to Princeton for a PhD. Well, after I finished a master's, I went to Taiwan as an international student. My goal was to stay there for a year, learn the language of the mainland, study there for 6 months, then go to Princeton. After 6 months of living in Taiwan, I realized I learned more about the Chinese in that 6 months than I had studying them for 6 years. So I decided Princeton was a dumb idea, and so I stayed. I didn't plan on staying for 14 years, though. In the first lesson of my program for international students, I'll explain that in a little bit, I tell the story of how being in the backseat of a taxi in Taipei changed my life. I had an idea about cross-culture that came from nowhere that changed my life. Best idea I've ever had. at that time, I was really frustrated. About a year and a half in Taiwan, I was really frustrated. I knew how to do the simple things, how to order dinner, where to sit. I knew how to be polite. I didn't understand why the Chinese did these, in my opinion, wrong things, that their cultural norms were, wow, why would they do that? That's dumb. And I was very judgmental. Well, the idea was that the Chinese must have reasons to do the things they do in the way they do. And if I wanted to understand the Chinese, I needed to know those reasons. That idea has propelled my career. That changed the trajectory of everything I've done. I almost overnight, I became comfortable living in Taiwan because I understood why things happened the way they did. I stopped having cross-culture questions because my knowledge that I gained about why Chinese and Chinese thinking, especially, gave me answers for everything. Like I say, that became my career. I became a cross-culture specialist. 1987, I wrote a book. It's now called Logical Thinking and Communication, trying to teach Chinese and eventually Japanese, Korean, Hong Kong, Thai, the rudiments of thinking logically. And that in 1990, I started to teach Westerners how to do business and work and live with Chinese, and I started to teach Chinese how to live, work, and talk to Westerners. It was a wonderful situation because when I taught Westerners, they'd complain about the Chinese, so I'd learn things. I'd go to teach the Chinese, they'd complain about Westerners, so I learned things. And basically, I was getting paid to learn. It was a wonderful situation. I've taught these seminars on 4 continents. I couldn't retire because the last actual job I had was being an editor at the Asia Pacific Anti-Communist League in Taiwan in 1986. I'm not an academic in any way. I am a freelance corporate trainer consultant. My whole existence depended upon me being able to produce measurable results that would help a company make more money in 4 hours or 8 hours, or I didn't get paid or I didn't get work. And so I'm very results driven. Well, I couldn't retire because I didn't have a job to retire from. And so I decided I wanted to take everything I've learned and to help international students. And so I've recently created and finished a program, an online training program, micro lessons, 36 5-minute lessons to help international students adjust to life at school in the West, at school, at work, and in the community. I'm quite proud of that. Course. Well, when that was finished, I still wasn't finished. So I was wondering what to do. I wanted to work now with adults. And I don't know, you probably all remember when there was the big Costco versus MAGA about DEI about 6 weeks ago, I'm guessing. And that reading that gave me the idea of DEI. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that what I did fit DEI very well. I consider myself an expert in cultural competence, and that is what I'm going to try and give to or help DEI with. I created a course, I'm creating it right now, called Let Plato Help Improve Your DEI Results. I'm a believer that understanding Western culture, which is something that very few Westerners actually do, will help people become part of a group, a bigger group. It will help them understand why they do the things they do, how they fit in to a larger goal. It'll help migrants I hope that's the right word. What do you call immigrants? That's the proper word. New Americans, new Westerners? I don't know. So I call them migrants. I hope that's okay. Migrants, people don't understand. Western culture is, in my opinion, the most difficult culture in the world to understand and adapt to. I'd call Chinese second, so I lived in one and I became quite culturally competent in the other. I speak Mandarin. I have a Chinese wife now for 32 years. What I learned in general was that if you understand why people do what they do, you understand their motivation, you can now live with them easier. You can now accept differences they have, because the differences they have are legitimate, because you can trace them back to why. Every culture has a cultural goal, and that I can trace just about every action in Western culture back to Plato and the goal of discovering new knowledge. Everything from open-mindedness to sharing ideas to the principles and the goals of DEI, they're all there as part of what you need to discover new knowledge. And so I gained a great respect for other cultures because I realized that they were doing what, in their opinion, was the right thing to do. They weren't just jerking me off. They weren't just doing things. They had reasons for doing things. And if I wanted to understand them and work with them, I needed to know those reasons. Last thing I'll say is that I've been told many times that people will say, oh God, I never thought of looking at it that way. I'm totally self-taught. I never learned anything about culture or anything in a classroom. Basically, I taught myself. And that was good. Hard, but good, because I developed a new way of looking at cross-culture, a new perspective. And by teaching that perspective, people have a much better chance of understanding and accepting differences. Right now, we're told just to, well, this is the way Westerners want you to do things, do it that way. Well, people need to know more if they're going to wholeheartedly change the lessons of the culture, the lessons they grew up with, to now do what they consider, or their culture considers, to be wrong. And so I'm all about helping people understand the motivation behind other cultures, the why behind other cultures. And other than that, I write books. I'm a decent cook. I golf like I've never had a lesson. I've never let my chronic pain get in front of me. Here are the pills the pain pills I've got today, the rest of them. And that I became much more accepting. So I apologize for taking so long and such a meandering, boring story. I like to make people laugh. I hope I've done a little bit of that right now. Thank you very much. And thank you, Joseph, for including me in this panel.
Warm my heart. It's a pleasure to have you, Greg. Certainly, you have added quite a bit, especially when you talk about your newfound DEI. I keep telling people that the question is, do we know what it means? And I think that with that and the type of thing you just expressed, you're going to begin to see how you can impact those corporations, because a lot of them don't even know what the values are, and certainly they don't know how to utilize those values in order to enhance their bottom line, which is what they are pushing ahead. And research shows quite remarkable progress on that particular area. So thank you for coming.
So again, I have a question for Dr. Angela Cleo-Smith. My question is, how has systemic racism transformed over time? and what multidimensional strategies have proven most effective in dismantling its structural barriers, addressing the historical injustices, and promoting the sustainable racial equity. So let me just explain, my question a bit. Basically, this question you have to explore the historical evolution and the contemporary manifestations of the systemic racism, examining how the racial discrimination has transitioned from explicit, legally sanctioned practices like slavery and segregation to the institutional forms of oppression embedded within the economic, political, and the social system. So, I want your views on this. On to you, Doctor.
Oh, thank you. It could be a complex question if you don't really understand systemic racism and some of the evolution that has aspired or inspired. And so, systemic racism, you have to know it refers to the ways in which racial inequality is embedded in our structures, it's embedded in our policies and practices of institutions, which leads to these disparities across various sectors of societies, such as education, housing, healthcare, employment, even the criminal justice system. So, this evolution of systemic racism has been deeply intertwined in historical events such as slavery, segregation, colonialism. But it's also transferred over time. And I'm going to go through a little bit about over some of the social and economic changes over time. So, slavery and legalization of racism from the 17th to the 19th century. Let's talk about that for a moment. Systemic racism in the US began with the institution of slavery, right? Where Black people were treated as property. And it stripped all the rights. They were subjected to brutal labor under laws that dehumanized them. So the legal system codified racism through state laws. And so with that, racism was institutionalized in economic systems, and that exploited Black labor. So if we go on to the post-Reconstruction and Jim Crow laws, and now that was late 19th century to early 20th century. So after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, the South implemented Jim Crow laws. And this is why it's so important that young people understand education, and not only young people, about our education and our history. So this enforced racial segregation and disenfranchised Black Americans. Even though slavery has been abolished and disenfranchised, the new system of racial subordination persisted in all aspects of life. These laws ensured that Black Americans were segregated from whites in schools and public spaces, transportation, and even in our workforce. So we can look more at the post-World War II, the Civil Rights Movement, and that was the 1940s through the 1960s. I'm giving a little history lesson in a kind of a chronological order, but the Civil Rights Movement marked this turning point in challenging systemic racism. There's a landmark legislation such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights of 1965 that sought to dismantle institution segregation and eliminate discrimination in public accommodations like education, employment, and voting. However, these legal victories did not fully dismantle the underlying structures of racism, and that's why it's important to understand. Despite these legal changes, segregation and economic inequality persisted in more subtle forms, such as discrimination in housing, school to prison pipeline, and disparities in the criminal justice system. So when we look at the modern day systemic racism from, let's say, the 1970s to present day, while legal segregation was dismantled, systemic racism has evolved, into more covert forms. It now manifests in practices and policies that disproportionately affect people of color. in areas such as policing, healthcare, education, and employment. So these issues as mass incarceration, racial profiling, disparities in access to quality education and healthcare. So structural racism is also perpetuated through economic inequality, which Black and Latino families historically have less access to generational wealth. So let's move on to some of the effective strategies for combating systemic racism. So civil rights legislation laws, the Civil Rights 1964 and voting 1965 were pivotal in dismantling institutional segregation, but the continuous advocacy for policies that address voter suppression and housing discrimination is still crucial today. Now let's talk a little bit about affirmative action. These policies were created to address the historical and ongoing effects of racial discrimination by ensuring equal access to education and employment opportunities for the marginalized groups. These policies, through controversial at times, of course, have helped increase access to higher education and professional opportunities for African Americans and other minorities. However, now that affirmative action is no longer here, we have to look more now at police reform and criminal justice reform. The fight for police reform, especially after incidents like the George Floyd incident, Breonna Taylor, and many, many others, it's brought attention to racial disparities in policing. These policies, such as the End Racial Profiling Act, independent oversight of police departments, these body cams, changes to broken windows, policing practices. These are being discussed as ways to reduce systemic racism within law enforcement. So let's talk reparations for a moment. Although not universally accepted, the idea of reparations, whether through direct payments or community investment, is a proposal to address some of the lasting legacy of slavery, segregation, and systemic inequality by providing compensation or support to those directly affected. And I've had this conversation just recently, and we're still talking about it. So we'll see what happens with that. But I always believe that grassroots activism and community organizing is the best way to create a movement. So we talk about the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. If we go back to those same efforts of the activism like Dr. Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they helped highlight the systemic nature of racism, especially in the Southern states, right? Their work led to the passage of these key civil rights laws. Now, we're bringing you back up to date, Black Lives Matter movement. Now, this began in response to the police killings of unarmed Black people, has played a pivotal role in organizing against police brutality and racial injustice. And I'm hoping that the audience can understand some of this, keep these conversations going. The Black Lives Matter movement, these activists have continued to spotlight systemic racism in law enforcement, and their protests have led to significant conversations about how to reform the justice system. So let's go on a little bit more before I end this conversation, because it's almost like I'm thinking about an essay when I write this, because these questions are very profound, they're thought-provoking, and it's something that we can continue the conversation. So when we talk about education and awareness, these campaigns for raising awareness about the history and ongoing nature of systemic racism is the key to dismantling it. So educational programs and initiatives that focus on teaching about race, privilege, and institutional inequities can help challenge the prejudices and create broader support for systemic change. So I'm going to move forward to legal accountability and intersectional advocacy. So When we talk about the legal challenges against discriminatory practices and, again, housing, education, employment, and policing, civil rights lawyers, advocacy groups, and public policy experts, they often challenge unfair practices in the courts and through legislative means. So I want to use this word intersectionality, and it covers so many different things. But if we recognize that systemic racism affects different communities in distinct ways, advocacy for racial justice should be intersectional, meaning addressing not only race, but also gender, class, sexuality, and other factors that intersect with identity. So this ensures that the needs of the most marginalized within the communities of colors are met. So despite the challenges and the progress that have been made, systemic racism still continues. It requires a sustained effort from all levels of society to effectively combat it. Political leaders, community activists, educators, and individuals like yourselves and me must continue to challenge racial inequities in every aspect of society. So, effective strategies for combating systemic racism include legislative reforms, grassroots activism, education, economic justice, and legal accountability. And with these efforts, when combined with a commitment to long-term societal change, we can help break down that structural barrier and that sustained racial inequality. And I hope this was helpful, because I did go through a sequential history lesson here. But the bottom line is, it takes you, it takes me, it takes all of us combined and to make a commitment. And it's not going to be overnight. We do see some changes, of course, but we have to break down those structural barriers. And I hope that answers the question, Professor.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really lustrous and very deep and very good.
I joined Greg to clap because he was profound answer. So thank you so much. I was loving it. I was hearing what people were saying. Then I kept thinking, if laws were to change things, we wouldn't be where we are today. So we may have to begin to look at the laws and begin to figure out, are there other ways, which she went further to enumerate quite a number of them. What I would like to say, just kind of reading a comment from Robert Owen, a rich manufacturer from Wales, England. He gave two long addresses. One of them was for 3 hours to the US Congress, and that was in 1825. Here are some of the things he said. There was, he told the lawmakers, an urgent need to establish a new system of society, one that will be based upon principles of strict justice and impartial kindness. And the reason why I wanted to look at it is to reflect on that before I go to whether it's education, job, housing, getting land, getting profit, sustaining it, and banking it, and the building upon it. Investors could tell us more about this. It's the same thing. So I'm beginning to question, how do we best handle this? And this is what comes to my heart. I believe that people are born wherever they are born. People develop wherever they develop. And as they develop, they suck up the characteristics of things they observe and the one they don't observe. And those things cumulatively help to shape their belief system. And hence it's shaped. You cannot lie about it. They will drive their behavior, either in a secret way or in obvious ways. So with that, I feel like we are really at a crossroad. We have to try our best as human beings, but human beings are so complicated. So I'm of the view that we continue to try all aspects. Nothing is off the table, because you never know what will work. So to that, I want to bring Dr. Gwendolyn, because he has done so much work. I hate to bring this one up, but I need to. Recently, World Bank stated that 70% of children in low and middle income countries cannot read by the age 10. And if you look at the United States, you see that educational system, we've always had dichotomy in educational system. Used to be the one that we are done for people who can think, people who can be leaders. So you train them to be thinkers because that will enable them to make decisions we can live with. And for those who are not in that category, they become the second part. And those second part are the people who are given inferior education, sometimes a vocal education where they kind of learn mechanic or all those type of art-related work. Those things are very good work, even particularly at this time. So I want to go to the doctor because she has demonstrated through her writing, which I've read quite a bit of them, through her teaching, focusing on African American issues and how she may be doing this. So what I want her to tell us is going to be simple. Can you tell us a story about this educational system based on your experiences, what you have observed, what you are doing to change the trajectory so that everyone will be recognized for his God-given intelligence because everyone has it. The question is, how do we prepare them? And based on your work, could you tell this audience what they can take home and be using it even in their own terms? And we're going to be getting you more to begin to speak more on those issues. Thank you very much.
First, I would like to thank everyone for giving me this opportunity. I am a literacy and leadership specialist, and I've been committed to dismantling the barriers that prevent marginalized communities from assessing the power of literacy. For over 2 decades, I have worked in classrooms, trained educators, and developed literacy initiatives that empower students, again, particularly Black and Brown children, to reclaim their intellectual agency through reading. My mission has always been, if leaders are readers, then every student must be a reader. And that starts with dismantling the systems that keep literacy out of the reach for so many. If leaders are readers, all students must become readers by erasing gaps, opening minds, and reclaiming the intellectual power. I have found through my work that literacy is more than a skill. It is agency, access, and freedom. For generations, barriers have been placed between Black and Brown communities and the written word, not because we can't learn to read, but because once we do, we begin to see, we begin to question, and dismantle the systems designed to hold us back. Every child deserves not just the ability to decode words, but to read the word, to read the world. I'm going to say that again. Every child deserves not just the ability to decode words, but to read the world, to analyze history, to challenge narratives, and create new possibilities. And that is what I am doing in classrooms and working with principals, working with literacy teams, working with parents, and working with communities. We must not only close the literacy gap, but we need to eliminate it entirely. And that just doesn't take place in the classroom. Parents have to change the way they are parenting their children and looking at society today. Ensuring that reading is a tool of empowerment, and that's a new word for many of our parents, our teachers, our administrators, the tool of empowerment, rather than a marker of inequality. When I do this in schools and talk with parents and talk with administrators, they are shocked when I talk about the word empowerment rather than inequality. But this is the fight that I'm in. This is the future. The question is, are we bold enough to make it happen? Literacy is not just about reading words on a page. It's about reading the world. Brown and Black communities have historically been denied access to literacy as a form of control, from anti-literacy laws during the slavery to the modern day school to prison pipeline, which often begins with failing reading proficiency. In my last school, I had many children whose parents were in prison, or they were on drugs, or just the other day, a parent was in the kindergarten parking lot, and she overdosed. And of course, the police had to be called. The second day, her kindergartner was irate. He cursed out the teachers. He did all kinds of things. But the social worker was there. The director of social services was at the school. And she was able to bring the child in, looked at his data, and found out that he was not at grade level proficiency. Since that time, she has started to work with the student, providing the skills that were had not been given to this child. Also, the father has been called in. So if you notice, I'm working with not only the skills and strategies of literacy, but empowering students and parents and community to change their mindset. My work focuses on restoring literacy as a form of liberation, helping students build cognitive skills, their thinking skills, engaging in critical thinking, and ultimately changing their economic and educational trajectories. And that is something that is different. Everybody talks about changing skills, but I'm going further. There are cognitive functions that really need to be developed not only in teachers, but in students and in families. We always talk about the executive functions. It's kind of like driving a car. If the cognitive functions that we need to change, they are the motor, they would provide the motor, and then those executive functions would be the driver. Well, the driver can't drive if those cognitive functions are not working, which is the motor. And that's my goal, is to work on the motor, that part that builds cognitive skills, engages in critical thinking, and ultimately changing their economic and educational trajectories. The final thing that I want to say for that is that the ability to read proficiently by fourth grade determines future success or incarceration. So I am on a mission and continue to be on that mission to ensure that no child is left behind in the war for literacy equity.
Well, thank you so much. As usual, I love your take on this, and continue the hard work. It's never easy. Even some people that don't know, I've been groomed in a place in Pennsylvania, and I happen to know some small communities where when you go there, mostly what the people there have in common with Black people is poverty. These are white people, and the trajectory of their lives are just as predictable as some of the people that we've used as slaves to paint, use their pigmentation of skin to say what they can and cannot do. We are all gifted and born in the image of God, gifted in many ways. Unfortunately, we have people who may be benefiting by sort of creating these walls that persist. As a result, some people may say, oh, we are better than these people, and that division continues to deepen. So I can't think of a better way to say that you are doing the thing, catching them at a younger age and turning their life trajectories in better ways. So thank you so much for all the input you brought into this equation. I appreciate it very much.
My next question is for Dr. Angela again. How can non-African American serve as a strong, informed, and active allies in the fight for the racial equity and justice? And what comprehensive strategies can they adopt to effectively challenge the systemic racism while avoiding the performative activism. Basically, this question, I want you to explore the role, responsibilities, and the impact of the non-African Americans in advancing the racial justice, and also critically examine the allyship not just as a moral obligation, but as the actionable strategy and the sustainable approach to dismantle the systemic racism. So, would like to have your view on this.
Oh, thank you. I love this question because, we've heard this before. What can we do, from non-African American and others? What can we do to serve and help in racial equality? Non-African Americans can play a crucial role as strong allies in the fight for racial equality and justice by both engaging in active and reflective actions. And I'm going to go over a little bit about what that means. So the first thing you want to do is educate yourself. So learn about the history and impact of racism. So you have to understand the historical and ongoing struggles faced by African Americans and other communities of color. Familiarize yourself with the effects of systemic racism, the discrimination that goes on, and the broader social context of racial injustice. You need to read, listen, engage with books, articles, podcasts, documentaries created by Black authors, activists, and scholars. Pay attention to Black voices and lived experiences. So you want to listen and amplify Black voices and be that active listener. So when discussing race, listen to the voices of African Americans without interrupting or trying to explain their experiences. I've experienced that, the interruption, they're not really understanding. So in order to do that, you can use your platform, whether it's social media, work, or social circles, to elevate the work and the ideas of Black individuals. Also, this is one thing that non-African Americans don't acknowledge enough of, is recognizing your privilege or their privilege. Understand how your racial identity may grant you advantages in society and how these privileges are tied to systems of power and oppression. So you have to acknowledge this privilege without guilt and use it to advocate for change. Take that responsibility rather than becoming defensive. And I've seen that before. Take responsibility for any unconscious bias or ignorance and use that awareness to foster positive change. So you can support anti-racist policies and initiatives. So you advocate for policy change. Support policies that aim to dismantle racial inequality, such as the criminal justice system, education reform, and equitable healthcare access. Get involved in local initiatives. You can't save the world, but support community programs, businesses, and organizations led by people of color, particularly those focused on racial equity. So whenever you hear something, speak up in that moment. Challenge racism when you encounter it, whether in social settings, at work, in everyday life, your family discussions. Call out discriminatory behavior and racist remarks. Do so respectfully, of course, but firmly, making it clear that such behavior is unacceptable. So you have to first confront your own biases. Recognize when you may be perpetuating racial stereotypes or microaggressions and work to change those barriers. Another way could be support Black-led movements and organization. Donate, fundraise, contribute to organization and movements that focus on racial justice, such as the Black Lives Matter movement, or other grassroots organizations advocating for systemic change. You can volunteer your time and your skills, offer your skills and time led by Black communities, from legal advocacy to community organizing. Be open to feedback. If someone from the African American community calls you out on something, I always call people in instead of calling them out. Accept their feedback with grace and willingness to learn rather than getting defensive. You have to continue to grow. Allyship is a lifelong process. So constantly reflect on your own actions and behaviors and continue to strive to grow and do better. So you can support economic equity by investing in Black businesses. Go out and support Black-owned businesses, whether by purchasing products, offering professional services, or just advocating for others to do the same. Also, encourage workplace diversity. If you're in a leadership position, advocate for equitable hiring practices and diverse representation within your organization. This is where DEI comes in. Different perspectives is really, really meaningful. You want to hear from other people. If you have the same people from the same experiences, doing the same thing, talking about the same, the growth does not happen that way. So this is another thing you might want to do is engage in difficult conversations. Be honest. And when you're talking about race, have the courage to talk openly about race and racism, especially in spaces where people might avoid these conversations. Be bold, speak up. This could include talking to your family members, your colleagues, or friends who may have different views. Challenge those misconceptions. When others perpetuate racist myths or stereotypes, take the opportunity to provide accurate information and challenge those harmful narratives. So, to conclude, I want to make sure that you support restorative justice efforts by advocating for alternatives to punitive justice systems that disproportionately harm communities of color. Restorative justice practices can provide healing for all involved. So, being a strong ally requires that consistent action, your own self-reflection, and a willingness to take risk. It's also it's about showing up in the spaces where African Americans need the support the most, whether through advocacy, education, or tangible action. Allies can help create lasting change when they stand in solidarity with marginalized communities. So work to dismantle systems of oppression and commit to creating a more equitable society for everyone. We all deserve it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. These strategies, what you've mentioned, they are extremely good. And I think we should derive some good lessons and continue to practice in order to support. On to you, Doctor.
Well, Greg, I'm going to come to you again today. That's right. You have quite a bit to let us know. So the question I have for you is this. Having been exposed to different cultures, especially from Canada to Asia, to the point that you speak the language very well. I tell people they don't know any culture until they get into the locality, be with those people, looking just like when I went to Cancun. I didn't know Cancun until I went to the other Cancun. They have two Cancuns, the place you go if you have American money and spend money there. And really poor one, where when you go, you see real people. And what you learn from those two places are different, entirely different. So based on that, and fundamentally our belief that you are shaped by your experiences. More experiences you have, the better you're equipped to deal with people around the world. So based on your experiences with Canada, Asia, Westerners as you characterize them, and then getting to Aristotle. Aristotle is, I'm a scholar of Aristotle. I love Aristotle's the three dimensions, ethos, logos, and pathos. Now, how would you use what you've gotten there to stir up debate that will be constructive, to get, would I say, ill-informed, to get to know what it means in the argument for the purpose of African Americans that have been marginalized, have been denied the houses they got after the Reconstruction, that are still being, diminished in many ways, including politics, where people can choose who they want to elect them rather than the electorate choosing them. and education, jobs. How would you use those beautiful wonders of Aristotle to put us in the right trajectory?
And you said it was a short question wanting a short answer. First, I wrote an essay called China Has Changed, the Chinese Haven't. I got lots of bad, but they were people who never read the essay, because the essay wasn't about Chinese. It was about Westerners who have an idea that the Chinese they meet, they're on the power side of the desk, the Westerners, like they are in the black and white in America. They're on the power side of the desk, and that the Chinese that they meet all speak English, they've been in the West, and so now, ipso facto, the Westerners go, well, that's what my Chinese, and I've heard this hundreds of times, my Chinese are like, or my Chinese are not like that, Greg. And that I tell them, well, wait a minute, your Chinese, what does that mean, my Chinese, that they're Western now? Okay, that now they have changed and they're no longer Chinese. That's definitely not true. You walk down a street in Shanghai, Taipei, Beijing, anywhere. Down the main street, it's Westernized. And the people that you meet there will be more or less in tune with many of what you think. But you go 1 block off, 2 blocks off, and you're in a totally different country, totally different culture. And if you really want to understand the other culture, don't go to rely on knowing the people who've got the badge, that won the award, or that are in the news, that, are what Westerners say, my blacks, my African Americans. You have to go to the people who are struggling. You have to go to the people who are still trying to be empowered. They're still trying to become more than they are. And so, I believe, I've learned anyway, that I pay attention to what someone does. I pay attention to where they are in society, the hierarchy and such, but that I don't use them to make my final decisions. I try and use more realistic people. As earlier I said, I was a realistic progressive, and that looking at people who agree with your cultural norms, who do things the way you think they should be done, and by you I mean white American, if you have to look beyond that. You can't use those to make decisions about what is needed, because if you just look at those, not much is needed. These people are already halfway to where the whites want them to be. But that's not the case for 95% of the black people who are struggling. And so that's what I say. It's real easy to teach to the best students in your class. But that's not how you get good results. You have to lift people up, not just reward them for what they are already. So that's what I have to say on that. I hope that was useful. No idea.
As always, thank you so much. We're going to bring you back on to go deeper into Aristotle, because the guy gave us so much that people don't even know, but people keep talking about him. Based on what I saw and read about your work, we're going to get you back, because that gives us something to do with the African American issues.
I have one thing about Aristotle. It's very quick. Aristotle's my favorite because he taught me how to be happy. At a very bad time in my life, I read Aristotle Ethics. And that in that he says that as one sunny day does not make summer, one happy moment does not make happiness. Happiness is something that you earn, that you work before. You get happy for doing the best you can considering the circumstances. And since I've learned that, I've gone through hell in my life, but I've always been happy because I always know I'm doing my best to get out of this bad situation. And so that's the first thing that comes to mind about Aristotle.
You're a wise man. You're a wise man. Let me shift. We need to get Glandel,
Yes.
opportunity to perhaps answer a question. And Dr. Namita Radford, that's up to give. Could you give?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sure. Yes, my question is for Dr. Levitt. How can your work actively address the persistent inequities faced by women and communities of color, particularly Black and Brown population, in education and economic advancement to achieve the sustainable parity with the mainstream population? On to you,
I'm sorry.
Dr. Levitt.
So the state of literacy today is unacceptable, especially when we know what works and yet continue to fall into the same traps. Ineffective instruction, systemic inequalities, and a failure to address the cognitive foundations necessary for reading success. So there are changes to the trajectory that is needed. And I'm going to give you about 6 of those, and I'm hoping that it will touch on the question that you ask. There needs to be a cognitive shift. We must stop treating literacy as a set of disconnected skills and start addressing it as a cognitive process. Reading is thinking, and if students don't develop the cognitive functions necessary, auditory processing, visual discrimination, working memory, and executive functions, they will continue to struggle, and it will affect the economy that we have today. It will affect the day-to-day workings of our communities, our day-to-day working that our parents have to go to on a day-to-day basis. Number 2, intentional high-quality teaching. And I'm talking about those things that have to happen in the classroom and then move out into our society. The science of reading gives us a strong foundation, but it's not enough to teach phonics and hope for the best, because that's what we're finding in schools. We need teachers who are trained to teach reading effectively, not just implement a program from publishing companies. Too many educators are trying on or relying on scripts rather than responding to students' needs in real time, understanding that our children have to go out into the world and do the work that they need to be successful. The order of teaching has to meet the science of reading in the classroom in order to be moved out into the world. Equity and access. Remove systemic barriers. Too many brown and Black children in poverty, and multilingual learners are still being denied high-quality instruction, placed in remedial groups, and labeled before given a real chance. We have to stop misidentifying reading struggles as disabilities and start providing targeted, structured interventions early. And then parental and community involvement. Literacy must extend beyond the school walls. Parents need to be equipped, empowered, and engaged in the process. When parents, especially those who may struggle with literacy themselves, and then we have that intergenerational illiteracy that's going on, which is at a very high percentage, they can understand how to support their children. We see a shift when parents have this information. Community-based literacy initiatives, partnerships with churches, barbershops, and local businesses, and school-based literacy nights should be a required, not an afterthought. And that's why I was able to move my last school from an F to a B, because of the parental and community involvement. Accountability at all levels, including leadership. If a school has not moved to literacy proficiency in 4 years, It's time to look at leadership. This is not a game. Every child deserves access to proficient reading instruction, and we can no longer accept mediocrity in how we approach literacy. Schools that fail to move the needle need to rethink their strategies. And then lastly, bringing back joy and purpose to literacy, not only literacy in the classroom, but in the home, in Sunday school classes, in businesses. I knew of a company, and they had literacy groups going on all of the time, where they had a particular book that dealt with the product that they were producing. And so they read weekly to increase not only their intellectual knowledge, but to improve the productivity of their company. Children don't just need to learn to read, they need to see why reading matters. Cultural relevance, engagement, and identity must be woven into the literacy experience. Books should reflect the lives of students reading them, and literacy instruction should connect to the real world in meaningful ways. So my final thought is, we are now at a crossroads. We can keep blaming the system, or we can build a village that ensures that every child reads, which goes out into the world. This is not about trends. It's not about programs or politics. It's about delivering on the promise of literacy for all so that we can change the world.
Well said. Thank you so much. Our distinguished panelists are equal to the task. So I'm very, very proud of them, and certainly happy that you are all here. I hope the other people feel the same way. Unfortunately, as always, time had impeded our ability to get the audience more involved. But in subsequent times, we'll try to do better. So for those of you that could have asked questions, bear with us. And I want you to, when you get to the LinkedIn, of course, if you're a part of SDIG, you know that LinkedIn is where they sort of put their things. So if you go there, you can begin to read what they're writing, the new ideas, the new knowledge, and so on. And together, we will all grow and make the world a better place. So on that, I have to say thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, I have a very important closing reflection to all the panelists. Together we stand, voices strong, fighting for justice, righting the wrong. With courage and hope, we pave the way for a brighter, fairer, better day. May our actions speak, our purpose stay, and as we rise for change and light the way. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.